Well, good morning, everybody. Can everybody hear me? All clear. Great. 2 points I'll make at the start is I'm very happy to take questions. And equally, I apologise I can't stay with you for lunch. I've got another engagement that I've got to get to. But can I acknowledge Tom and Bruce, nice to see you again. And of course, Grant, wonderful to be back on campus. I'm just going to start with a little anecdote on the Right Honourable title, because many of you won't know quite what it means. When you go to Parliament, you're a backbencher and everybody wants to get to be a cabinet minister. Once you become a cabinet minister, you become the honourable. So I achieved that. Then back in the sort of 70s, 80s and the early 90s, if you're a prominent member, as Simon Upton was, I can think of Paul East, Doug Graham, Bill Birch, the Prime Minister of the day had the ability to add to you the Right Honourable title. Then in the Helen Clark government that started at the end of 1999, of course we moved away from using the Privy Council, because the Right Honourable in those days actually gave you, it was the title of being able to be a member of the Privy Council. When we gave away access to the Privy Council and established the Supreme Court here in New Zealand, we thought there'd be no more Right Honourables again. John Key then, as Prime Minister, the Honourable John Key, as he was at that stage, then had a weekend with the Queen in Balmoral. And the two of them got talking about the fact there were no more Right Honourables. So she commanded that John established the tradition in New Zealand whereby the Prime Minister and the Speaker of the Parliament, upon assuming those offices, will become Right Honourable. So that's where it's got to now. So Christopher Luxon became Right Honourable upon becoming Prime Minister. Jerry Brownlee became the Right Honourable upon becoming Speaker. Chris Hipkins, as a former Prime Minister, is known as Right Honourable. So there's the history of Right Honourables here in New Zealand. And talking about the title that's been given me, Paddock to Politics, I need to add that it's Paddock to Politics and back again, because I am very actively farming and I'm lucky to be able to do it. I'm now 73 years of age, farming on Banks Peninsula and a property in North Canterbury, and I love every day being back on the farm, and I'm very, very lucky at this age to have my health to do so. But as I go through my life, I'd start with my days at Lincoln, because I think Lincoln was extremely important 4 years and very formative for me. I'd been born a Christchurch kid, city born and raised, and I'm one of those guys that at a relatively early age, probably about 12 or 13, said, I want to be a farmer. And if you're city born and raised and want to be a farmer, there's no better way to do it and come to Lincoln and get a degree. So that was my path. I vividly remember my first day here, orientation day, and we went round to the lawn to the other side of Hudson Hall, and we were being addressed by somebody who I can't recall who it was. Might have been Jim Stewart, might have been Bruce Ross, might have been Terry Ludecker. There were 120 of us enrolled for the BAg course, BAg Science course, commencing in 1970, and the address given to us was, we were told that on average 2 of us would be dead by the end of the degree course, 4 years, killed on the road between Christchurch and Lincoln. I've never forgot those comments. I wish I could recall who did it. As I say, when I decided that I wanted to be farming, you've then got the battle of how do you get into a farm. And I need to acknowledge that I was lucky. Many of you might know of my dad. He was Morris Carter. He was a substantial builder in Christchurch. They still advertised houses in real estate magazines as Morris Carter homes, because they were built at a time when they didn't build them to leak. And they came with a sort of a moniker that's of some value when you're selling real estate. And I said to him, no point in me trying to be a farmer unless there's a way you can help me. He said, I'll do you a deal. I'll lend you half the money interest-free for 5 years, but you've got to pay it back at the end of 5 years. So between the two of us, we then, whilst I was still at Lincoln, looked at properties. And I remember we finally settled on one at West Melton. It was 250 hectares. I was looking at it from the point of view of irrigation potential, soil types, how much Templeton silt loam there was versus the Lismores, and he was looking at it from the road frontage point of view. Because in those days, there was an ambition around the city for people to move to lifestyle units. And in the first days, they were 5 acre or 2 hectare blocks. And the council planners of the day said, this is outrageous, we're cutting up all this land, we've got a brilliant way to stop it, we'll double it and make it 10 acre blocks or 5 hectares. And that didn't stop it, so they then moved to making it 20 acre blocks or 8 hectares. So by the time we bought the block, Dad could see the potential for capital gain if we quickly subdivided as we're allowed off the road, and we did that immediately after buying it. So I never intended to farm at West Melton for that long. I always had a plan to try and get some capital gain and look for a more substantial property somewhere. But then, as I was finishing my BAc degree here at the end of 73, 2 other things intrigued me that I happened to almost fall into. I'm just going to get a glass of water because I don't want Bruce's germs, if that's all right, Bruce. I was aware of a technology being developed at the time called embryo transplant, embryo transfer. And in those days, it was driven by human reproduction difficulties, if you like, and they were transferring it to livestock, particularly the cattle industry. In those days, it was very experimental. Ruakura and a Dr. Robin Trevette, from memory, was the pioneer here in New Zealand. It was all surgical, but you could mass produce from one superior donor using this technology called embryo transplant. At the same time, there was a huge interest here in New Zealand and in Australia in some of the European cattle breeds, the Simmental, the Charolais, Limousin, Chianina, Mainonju. There were quite a lot of them. Most of them haven't survived too well since. And there was interest in whether they would be of use to the New Zealand beef industry and particularly the Australian industry. What then happened was the quarantine rules of the time allowed these European breeds to leave Europe and cross to England. Those animals then, the donor, the cows, were never allowed to leave England, but their progeny could come to New Zealand. Those progeny, having arrived in New Zealand, were never allowed to leave New Zealand, but were allowed to go to Australia. I sort of coupled these 2 things together and found 2 other people who were prepared to invest with us, and we established a company at West Melton called New Zealand Transplant Breeders. People then were buying these expensive heifers. When I say expensive, they were selling in these days, I'm talking 1974, 1975, at $40,000 and $50,000 per heifer. Huge money. Yeah, converted to today, it's over $250,000. A lot of it was driven by a tax structure in Australia. But we then had the opportunity to collect these animals from clients, bring them to the West Melton property, transplant them. We used vets initially from Australia. They weren't that good. We then got vets from Canada who were probably the best in the world commercially at it at that time. The season worked perfectly well. Couldn't do it in the winter. So we'd use them in our summer. They'd fly back to Canada, do their summer, fly back to West Melton and do our summer. And again, my dear old dad, when I said I've got to build this surgery, he said, what are you going to do with it? How long is this venture going to last for? And I said, I think it has about 5 years, because these recipient animals were then quickly transferring over to Australia, some of them by plane. That's the sort of money that was involved in this thing at the time. I said about 5 years. And he said, well, what are you going to do with this surgery afterwards? I said, oh shit, I don't know. So he, again, being a builder, said, what you do is you build a house and you put the office and you put the toilet there, but you leave the walls out and you make it your surgery. And then the moment it closes down as a surgery, you put the rest of the walls on. It's on a separate title, and we sold our first block at Westmount. So there was a bit of luck involved. That company incidentally turned over $1 million in those days in its second year. So it was just a brief opportunity. I was lucky enough to get involved, but it sort of shaped my then time as I then became a Simmental cattle breeder myself. We shifted from West Melton over to the Banks Peninsula. So we looked around and we made reasonable money from the capital gain off West Melton. Wondered whether to go to the Warrap or the Hawke's Bay, North Canterbury. Looked around. Actually, the Banks Peninsula is a pretty special place to me. So we've bought a number of different properties as we've migrated around the peninsula. We currently farm 380 hectares at Teddington underneath Mount Bradley, if you know that area. And we have another 120, about a kilometre, 120 hectares about a kilometre away around the Teddington Flats. It used to be a very historic dairy farm established by the Gebby family, who of course came out with the Deans well before the first 4 ships. So we farm there today, and as I said at the start, having gone back to farming, thoroughly enjoyed that operation. The politics, we were a political family. My dad spent 40 years on the Christchurch City Council. So we used to go out and help him every 3 years on election day, because in those days you didn't postal vote for your councillors. You went to the polling booth and you cast your vote. So as kids, we'd be given a piece of paper with all the candidates that he wanted to have on the council with him. We'd go and deliver them on the Saturday morning, wait for the result in the council chambers, etc. That night. So I always had that interest in politics, even when I was here at Lincoln, but I was determined that I'd never follow him into local body politics. I then, happily farming, as I say, on Banks Peninsula. It's then in the Littleton electorate, and I get wind in 1993 that the National Party were looking for a candidate. So I rang a friend in the National Party and said, I might put my name forward. He said, are you a member of the National Party? I said, no, I'm not actually. I was, but you haven't chased me for subs, so I'm not. They quickly moved to remit, apparently, or an exemption, and I paid my sub. I went through the contest to win the Littleton nomination and became the National Party candidate. When I look back with a bit more political savvy than I had at those days, the chances of that winning that seat were pretty slim. If you remember the national swing in 1990, and some of you will, National polled extremely well. They gained a lot of seats they hadn't normally had. They held this one, the Littleton seat, with 68 votes. However, so I think, by unbeknown to me, the National Party had written it off and said, well, here's a dreamer, let him have a good go. We nearly won it. We lost it by about 300 or 400 votes. We had a really innovative campaign. I got a good team together. I was one of the first to carry a caravan around behind the car, gaily written, parking in all sorts of prominent places. One stage we had a little radio station going that just promoted my campaign. Must have been as boring as hell to listen to. But it got us onto national TV. You know, there was a 6 o'clock news slot with this guy down in Christchurch trying to win the national seat. Anyway, we lost it. And I thought, well, that's the end of my politics. I'm not trying that again. I'll go back to farming. And I did for about 12 months. And this date sticks in my mind very well. It was the 13th of July. It was a shit of a day. It was raining. It was hailing. We'd been out feeding out. I came in for coffee, and the radio was on the background, and it was that news flash. We're going to Parliament shortly. Ruth Richardson has called an urgent press conference. So that I'll wait and see what happens. So I waited. and it was Ruth Richardson announcing she was resigning immediately. And if you can recall the 93 election, Jim Bolger's national government won it with 1 seat to spare. There were 99 seats, 45 national, 44 Labour and Jim Anderton in alliance. With Ruth Richardson suddenly resigning, the very existence of that government was on a knife edge. So I listened to the news press conference, and I was putting my boots on. In those days, none of us had cell phones. The landline rings. I took my boots off, got back and answered. And it was a Herald reporter from Auckland saying, "You'll be putting your name forward, won't you?" And I said, I hadn't thought about it. So I went on and thought about it. I then decided I would give it one more go. There were 15 other contenders for the national nomination. It was the toughest, grueling interview process for about 10 days, because that's all the time that Bolger would allow before he'd set the date. He actually adjourned Parliament, and the country had to get this by-election done and dusted to know whether the government would survive. So it was a pretty hard campaign. Long and short of it, of the 15 that put their nomination forward, I did get there. I then worked like hell. We often refer to it, and I think Shona and John were both involved in this by-election. I remember it well. Still wear the scars. Yeah. The television followed, the news would start every night with where the candidates had been. So Marion Hobbs stood for Labour. John Wright was a guy who then got to Parliament. He stood for the Alliance. Alliance were the underbidders. They nearly won that so-on by-election. And the third guy was Tim Shadbolt for New Zealand First. And because it was a tense time, but he did add quite a lot of humour to the whole process. So anyway, that was the start of my political career, 1994. I remember the date well, 13th of August. I became a Member of Parliament. It could have been a short career because, of course, then we're moving to the first MMP election 2 years later. So the 99 seats that we traditionally had as electorates were all abolished and all redesigned to give us 66 electorates and room for list MPs. Again, I was then a bit lucky. I managed to get the Banks Peninsula electorate, which incorporated a lot of the area that Ruth Richardson had as the Selwyn electorate. I came back in 96, subsequently never won that seat again, because the boundaries did change, but I remained senior enough in the process to be a list MP, basically for the rest of my political career. I went there with the ambition to be Minister of Agriculture. That was what drove me to go to Parliament. And I was lucky that if you go back then to the lead from the 96 to 99, there was a time when the National Caucus actually changed their leader from Jim Bolger to Jenny Shipley. She revamped the cabinet, and I got a job as Minister outside cabinet and effectively the Associate Minister of Agriculture under John Luxton. It was a time when Jenny decided National wouldn't have a Minister of Agriculture. She called it the Minister for Food, Fibre, Biosecurity and Border Control. And I was therefore the Associate Minister of Food, Fibre, Biosecurity and Border Control. It wasn't a good move by Jenny Shipley. The farming community expected and wanted a Minister of Agriculture. We lost that election. I then did my 9 years of penance in opposition. I take you through then to 2008, when I became, John Key, of course, wins the election and wins it fairly well. I become Minister of Agriculture, and despite my comments about Jenny Shipley, I then proceed to change the Minister of Agriculture to the Minister of Primary Industries and bring fisheries and agriculture and forestry, biosecurity and food safety all into one ministry, which is actually a good move that has stood the test of time. So I was Minister for Primary Industries, amongst others. The next thing is, I remember it well, November 2000. Let me just go through my priorities as Minister of Agriculture or Minister of Primary Industries, because I think they're important. Determined to see science more involved in decision making. And I think that goes back to my involvement here at Lincoln. So I was instrumental in getting John Key to recognise the importance of science. He then appointed Peter Gluckman as the first science advisor to the government, and Peter Gluckman made a significant input on some of the decisions we have to make in Cabinet. I was determined to see better use of water. So we set up the Irrigation Acceleration Fund. We worked closely with Pat Morrison, late Pat Morrison those days, to finally get Central Plains off the ground. We tried in the Hawke's Bay unsuccessfully. But in my mind, climate change is going to happen. It is happening. The east coast of both lines is going to get tougher to farm in, but we're not short of water. We've just got to learn to use it better. We've got to learn to store it. The other priority for me was around biosecurity. I still think most New Zealanders do not realise how dependent we are on primary production for the income of this country, and therefore how dependent we are on biosecurity protection. So one of the things we've worked to, and the work is carried on, it's become apolitical, which is good news, is to sort government industry agreements around biosecurity incursions. And that was driven as much as anything, I'm not going for time because I don't want to let you late for lunch, that was driven as much as anything by one of my early meetings with officials, and they rushed into my office. I'd only been minister for about 4 weeks, and said, we have a biosecurity incursion. I said, what is it? It's the Mediterranean fanworm. And I said, what is it? What's the economic impact if it gets away from us? How much would it cost to get rid of it? They'd found this thing in Littleton Harbour on wharf pylons. They couldn't answer any of those 3 questions. What it was, economic potential damage, and how much would it cost to get rid of it. So they prepared a paper. I took it to Cabinet. I think we got them about $5 or $6 million to start diving onto the wharf of Littleton and picking these Mediterranean fanworms off the pylons. Back after the Christmas holidays in January, first meeting, they come back to us and said, we're going to abandon this project. And I said, why? We've found a massive infection in the Hauraki Gulf. We're wasting our time. It made me realise how important it was we actually had the questions answered about what is the economic impact of any incursion. And then, of course, it wasn't long before we had one. PSA into the kiwi fruit whilst I was still minister. That could have devastated the kiwi fruit industry. But again, we worked together. We had to urgently get them $50 million. They found money from their industry to back that $50 million, and there was that massive eradication of vines that were infected in PSA. And look how successful Zespri is for the country today. So biosecurity was critical. I think we made progress there. I move now to where life changes for me. I'm in Key's office for a meeting, and he said, would you stay behind afterwards, please? It's a bit like being called out by the headmaster or the vice chancellor. I thought, shit, what have I done? He said, would you be prepared to be speaker? And I said, I'm not sure. I need to talk to my wife. And I stepped outside his office, and then I realised that wasn't a request, it was a command. You don't turn down the Prime Minister. I had no ambition, no aspiration to be the Speaker of the Parliament. I didn't want to lose my involvement with agriculture. But when the Prime Minister puts that question to you, there's actually no choice. It was the greatest privilege I could have had. What a tremendous way to finish a parliamentary career, to spend, I think, 5 years as Speaker of the New Zealand Parliament. You're actually the person who's responsible for the functioning of New Zealand's democracy. I know that some of you might watch Question Time 2 o'clock every day. That's the high profile part. And it's tough. You go in there, you've got 119 or 20 other MPs, and they all think they know the books better than you. You've got to rule a question in order, out of order. You've got to stop bad behaviour. You don't have the ability to use the TMO like the All Blacks have. You've got to make a call. And you get some right, and you leave the chamber. Some you may have done differently if you'd had more time. I remember once I kicked John Key out, and that I've got a brother living in England. He rang me the next morning to say, what the hell are you doing now? But John Key just was using the rules and abusing the rules and creating havoc. My basic guiding principle was, if you're an elected member of parliament, you have a right to speak in our democracy, provided he or she then also obeys the rules. So it was a pressure job, but a privilege. You're involved in more than just question time. Of course, you're the landlord of the parliamentary complex, so your ultimate responsibility for, after the election, allocating office space, making sure MPs have got enough resourcing. I remember one we had to deal with was there was that dreadful shooting in the Ottawa Parliament, and we therefore had to up our security around Parliament and put in those extra ropes, etc. Which, you know, we wanted to keep the Parliament as open as possible. I think most MPs get a tremendous satisfaction seeing young kids in school groups coming in and sitting around the gallery for half an hour and watching democracy working. We just had to improve security. Those sort of decisions are ultimately the decision of the Speaker. Let me move now to interests now, and then we'll wind up to 4 questions. So family, of course, I'm lucky enough to have 3 daughters and 1 son, so the oldest is 31, and she's involved looking after some of the disadvantaged kids in this community. She's autism's her specialist. She's actually adopted a boy whose stepfather murdered the brother. So she works in that sector. Laura, my second daughter, works on the farm with me. And that's just a great delight to go out each day, start farming with one of your offspring. Isabella, Shona was asking about Isabella. She's our 3rd daughter. She's actually a rower, and she was lucky enough to get a rowing scholarship to go over to a university in America. Came back here, was actually a reserve for the Olympics last year in the rowing team up in Paris. Came back, went into the rowing squad, then got long COVID, so she's back home, and she's battled over the last 12 months, but she's determined to be back in that rowing team and hopes to get to the LA Olympics. And then finally, our son Morgan is 21 years of age. He's just finished his training as a commercial pilot, and in the job of trying to get his first job, the hardest job a pilot is to get the first one to get his hours up. The farm, of course, mentioned that's a real interest. The other interest is China. And I was lucky enough, there's a New Zealand-China Friendship Society for people who have had an association or an interest in China. They asked me to be patron, which has meant I've learnt a lot more about China. And I look around the room here, if you know anything about China, it's an economic miracle what's occurred there in our lifetime. Completely downtrodden, impoverished, absolutely exploited 100 years ago. Then the Civil War, then the invasion by the Japanese, then a further Civil War to sort it out, and the communists win. And then the way that economy has developed since then is something that I just find absolutely amazing. So I spend a fair bit of time up there. Does anybody here know of the name Rui Ali? Yeah, great. Rui Ali was a guy who was born in Springfield. He did his primary schooling in Aylesbury and then came to Boys High School in the time when it was at the Arts Centre, in the centre of town. Rui then went to China 100 years ago, the year after next, 1927, and devoted his life to China. He is just known by everybody there. Sadly, not that well known here. So I've been involved in the project which we actually opened on Saturday, establishing a Rui Ali Museum in the centre of Christchurch to recognise his achievement. The other thing I'm involved with, some of you may be interested in the Canterbury Agricultural Pastoral Association, the show. There was a year or so ago, and the then governors or board of the show decided they wouldn't have a show because they couldn't take the financial risk. Canterbury Show Week is iconic right throughout New Zealand. You cannot have Show Week unless you have a show. So myself and a few others have stepped up there. We got a good show running last year, a bit reduced. We only had 93 days to do it. We've run another good show this year. I think we've now got that thing back on a firm footing. And I think the future for the agricultural show being held in Christchurch is extremely important. It's all about that, bringing town and country together. And the final thing I involved with was Rural Co, and talking to Grant earlier. The Ashburton Trading Society was a buying co-op set up in mid-Canterbury, initially led by Federated Farmers, I'm learning. It's now trades as Rural Co, so I chair that board over the last few years, and it's been a pleasure to do that. So that's me, I guess, in summary. It's life after politics.